He gives the housekeeper a vacation, but what he didn't expect was to see her beautiful by the pool. Her transformation is shocking, and he begins to feel something he never imagined: jealousy. Before, he controlled everything. Now, he can barely stand the idea of someone looking at her. What began as a simple act of kindness transforms into a game of power and obsession. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We'll continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll hear in your life. The helicopter landed softly in the clearing, surrounded by imposing mountains. Richard Morgan stepped off the aircraft with the elegance of someone accustomed to commanding every movement around him. At 42, he owned a business empire that stretched across the country, with ventures ranging from mining to technology. His presence demanded immediate respect, and rarely did anyone dare to contradict him. Golden Ridge Retreat was his private escape, a luxury complex built especially to receive only the most select guests. There, away from the spotlight and endless meetings, Richard allowed himself some moments of tranquility. The place was a fortress of comfort and privacy, where every detail had been designed to satisfy his exacting standards. Walking along the Portuguese stone path that led to the main house, Richard observed the impeccably maintained gardens. Flowers bloomed in perfect geometric beds, and the soft sound of a water fountain created an atmosphere of serenity. Everything was exactly as it should be, under his absolute control. The main house, constructed of noble wood and natural stone, harmoniously integrated with the mountainous landscape. Large glass windows offered stunning views of the valley, while spacious verandas invited contemplation. Richard had designed every inch of that place with his own comfort and needs in mind. Upon entering the main hall, he was greeted by Mrs. Wilson, the housekeeper who had managed the retreat for over 10 years. A 60-year-old lady with grey hair pulled back in an impeccable bun. She knew each of Richard's preferences and anticipated his needs with military efficiency. "Good afternoon, Mr. Richard," she greeted him with a respectful bow. "Your suite is prepared as requested. Dinner will be served at 8 as usual." Richard nodded, satisfied with the predictability of the protocol. Here, unlike the outside world full of unpleasant surprises and complex negotiations, everything worked like a well-oiled machine. Each employee knew their role and executed it with precision. He headed to his suite on the second floor, a spacious environment decorated with Italian design furniture and carefully selected artwork. The walls covered in light wood created a welcoming atmosphere, while the stone fireplace promised pleasant evenings during the mountain winter. He positioned himself in front of the panoramic window that offered a spectacular view of the valley. Down below, a crystalline lake reflected the colors of the evening sky, while the mountains stretched as far as the eye could see. It was his private kingdom, where every tree, every stone, every ray of sunlight seemed to exist for his exclusive pleasure. In the following days, Richard followed his usual routine at the retreat. He woke up early, had breakfast on the veranda, read business reports, and made some important calls. In the afternoon, he walked the trails or relaxed by the heated pool. At night, he dined alone while appreciating the view of the mountains illuminated by the moon. It was during one of these morning walks that Richard noticed a different presence at the retreat. As he passed through the back gardens, where the organic vegetable gardens that supplied the kitchen were located, he spotted a woman working among the vegetable beds. She was facing away, bent over a row of tomato plants, and her movements were natural and focused. Richard stopped a few meters away, observing her work. The woman wore simple clothes, faded jeans and a light blue cotton blouse, and her brown hair was tied in a practical ponytail. There was something about her gestures that caught attention, an economy of movements that demonstrated knowledge and experience with that type of work. When she turned to pick up a wicker basket, Richard could see her face for the first time. She was a woman of approximately 30, with delicate but expressive features. Her brown eyes had a vivacity that contrasted with the simplicity of her appearance. When she noticed him watching, she didn't show the usual reverence of other employees. Instead, she just nodded politely and continued her work. Intrigued by this unusual reaction, Richard decided to approach. The retreat employees always bowed, in exaggerated reverence when he appeared, immediately interrupting their activities to pay attention to his needs. This woman, however, remained focused on her work as if his presence made no difference at all. "Good morning," he said, stopping near the bed where she was working. "Good morning, sir," she replied, briefly raising her eyes before returning her attention to the tomato plants. "Sorry for not stopping my work, but these tomatoes need to be harvested this morning before the sun gets too strong." Richard was surprised. No one had ever prioritized a trivial task over his presence. He was used to being the center of attention wherever he went, especially on his own properties. "And you are?" he asked, his voice carrying a tone of authority that normally made people rush to respond. "Emily Turner," she replied simply, placing more ripe tomatoes in the basket. "I've been working with the vegetable garden and gardens here at the retreat for about 6 months. Richard observed Emily more carefully. There was a serenity in her movements that intrigued him. She showed no nervousness in his presence, nor tried to impress him with excessive words or exaggerated gestures. It was as if he were just another ordinary person, not the powerful Richard Morgan who commanded an empire worth millions. "How long have you been working with gardening?" he asked, surprising himself with his own interest in prolonging the conversation. "Since childhood," Emily replied, carefully selecting the ripest tomatoes. "My grandmother had a small property in the countryside. I learned from her that the land has its own time and that there's no use rushing things that need to grow naturally." The simplicity of this philosophy sounded strange to Richard's ears, accustomed to accelerating processes, pressuring for results and controlling schedules. In his world, time was money, and waiting meant losing opportunities to competitors. "Interesting," he murmured, observing how she handled the plants with genuine care. "And what brought you here?" Emily paused for a moment as if considering how much she should reveal. "Life changes," she finally said. "Sometimes we need a quiet place to rethink our choices." There was something in the way she spoke that suggested complex past experiences, but Richard realized she wasn't willing to share personal details with a stranger, even if that stranger was her employer. In the following days, Richard found himself inexplicably interested in watching Emily work. He discreetly modified his morning walks to pass through the gardens at the time she would be there. He always found an excuse to initiate a brief conversation, asking about the plants or commenting on the weather. Emily answered his questions politely, but maintained a professional distance that he couldn't cross. She never showed the anxiety to please that characterized most people in his presence. She treated him with respect, but without the exaggerated deference to which he was accustomed. This unusual attitude began to occupy Richard's thoughts in unexpected ways. During his video conference meetings, he found himself thinking about the naturalness with which Emily treated each plant, as if she personally knew each leaf and each flower. When reading financial reports, his mind wandered to the simplicity of her philosophy about giving things time to grow naturally. Why was a common employee causing such an impact on his thoughts? Richard couldn't understand. He was used to attracting people's attention and interest, not the other way around. Sophisticated women of his social class often competed for his attention, offering intelligent conversations about art, politics, and business. Emily, however, seemed completely indifferent to his status and wealth. It was this indifference that intrigued him most. In a world where everything and everyone seemed to revolve around his power and money, finding someone genuinely disinterested in these things was a completely new experience. Emily treated him simply as a human being, without the filters and masks that normally mediated his social interactions. Gradually, Richard began to realize that he looked forward with anxiety to their casual encounters in the gardens. Her naturalness, her genuine connection with nature, and her apparent tranquility began to exert a magnetic attraction on him. It was as if Emily possessed something that all his money couldn't buy, a genuine inner peace and an authenticity that he had lost somewhere in his trajectory to success. Richard woke up that morning with a strange feeling in his chest. For the first time in years, he had dreamed of something that wasn't related to business. In his dream, he walked through the retreat gardens while Emily explained about the growth cycle of plants, her soft voice echoing among the mountains like A soothing melody. He got up earlier than usual and went to the window. Down below, even at dawn, he could see Emily already working among the beds. She always arrived before sunrise when dew still covered the leaves and the mountain air was cooler. Richard wondered what kind of life she led outside those working hours. During breakfast, served on the veranda overlooking the valley, Richard tried to concentrate on the reports he had brought from New York, but his eyes kept wandering to the gardens, trying to glimpse Emily's figure among the plants. Mrs. Wilson noticed his distraction. "Are you worried about something, sir?" asked the housekeeper, serving fresh coffee in his porcelain cup. "Just work matters," Richard replied automatically, but he knew it wasn't true. His business concerns were always compartmentalized with military precision. What he felt now was different, a restlessness he couldn't name or control. After breakfast, Richard decided to take a longer walk on the retreat trails. The mountain's pure air and physical exercise always helped him organize his thoughts. But even during the walk, his mind constantly returned to Emily and the way she had talked about giving things time to grow naturally. Upon returning, he passed through the gardens again. Emily was now working in a bed of aromatic herbs, and the scent of basil and rosemary perfumed the air. She greeted him with the same discreet nod as always, without interrupting her work. "What herbs are these?" asked Richard, getting closer than he usually did. "Basil, rosemary, thyme, and sage," Emily replied, pointing to each plant. "Mrs. Wilson asked to expand the herb garden. She says you appreciate well-seasoned food." Richard was surprised. He hadn't imagined that employees talked about his culinary preferences, or that Emily would know something about his personal tastes through other people. "And you?" he asked impulsively. "What do you like to cook?" Emily stopped what she was doing and looked directly at him for the first time. Her brown eyes had small golden spots that Richard hadn't noticed before. "Simple food," she replied after a moment. "Dishes that my grandmother taught me. Nothing sophisticated, but made with care." "Care," repeated Richard, as if trying out a foreign word. In his world, food was prepared by renowned chefs, served in starred restaurants or social events. The idea of food made with care sounded almost old-fashioned to him. "Do you find that strange?" asked Emily, and Richard noticed a slight amusement in her voice. "Not strange," he said, searching for the right words. "Just different from what I'm used to." Emily smiled for the first time since they had met, and Richard felt something move in his chest. Her smile was genuine, without the artificiality that characterized most people in his social circle. "Different experiences create different perspectives," she said, returning to work. "I imagine you've had experiences very different from mine." Richard nodded but couldn't elaborate a response. How could he explain that, despite all his luxurious experiences and material achievements, he felt curiously empty when comparing his life to Emily's apparent simplicity and contentment? In the following days, Richard began to invent reasons to spend more time in the gardens. He told himself he was supervising the work, checking if quality standards were being maintained. But the truth was that he felt magnetically attracted to Emily's presence. He observed that she had the habit of talking quietly to the plants while working, as if they were her confidants. When he asked about this, Emily laughed timidly. "My grandmother used to say that plants responded better when treated as living beings, not just decorative objects," she explained. "It may seem silly, but it's always worked for me." Richard didn't think it was silly. In fact, he began to envy the genuine connection Emily had with the world around her. Everything in her life seemed to arise from authentic relationships, with the earth, with plants, with nature. His relationships, on the other hand, were almost always mediated by power, money, or mutual interest. It was during one of these conversations that Richard made a mistake. Excited by the naturalness of the conversation, he commented on a trip he had recently taken to Europe. Casually mentioning luxury hotels and exclusive restaurants, he immediately saw a subtle change in Emily's expression. "It must be very interesting to be able to travel like that," she said politely, but Richard realized that the distance had returned to her voice. At that moment, he understood that he had broken something delicate. Emily wasn't interested in his wealth or lifestyle. On the contrary, these details seemed to remind her of the class difference between them, creating a barrier that he didn't know how to cross. During dinner that night, Richard found himself thinking about Emily's reaction. For the first time in his adult life, his wealth and power seemed more like obstacles than advantages. How could he genuinely connect with someone when everything around him screamed about status differences? He began to observe Emily more carefully, noticing details that previously went unnoticed. The way she greeted other employees with genuine affection, how she helped the older gardener with heavy tasks, how she always brought extra fruits from the garden to the kitchen without being asked. Richard realized that Emily possessed a natural generosity that sprang from an authentic place, not from social calculations or expectations of reciprocity. It was a quality he rarely found in his social circle, where kind gestures often hid hidden agendas. The perception that Emily was fundamentally different from the people he knew created a growing restlessness in him. During his business calls, he found himself comparing her authenticity with the artificiality of his fellow businessmen. During virtual social dinners, he observed how each word was calculated to impress or manipulate. One morning, Richard woke up with the decision to try a different approach. Instead of appearing in the gardens as the powerful owner of the retreat, he would try to approach Emily simply as Richard, the man behind the fortune. He found her working in a new area of the gardens, where she was planting lavender seedlings. The soft aroma of the plants created an almost magical atmosphere in the sunny morning. "Can I help?" he asked, surprising both Emily and himself. Emily looked at him with genuine surprise. "You want to help plant?" "Why not?" said Richard, crouching beside the bed. "I've never planted anything in my life. Maybe it's time to learn." Emily hesitated for a moment, as if assessing whether he was serious. Then, with a small but genuine smile, she began to teach him how to prepare the soil and position the seedlings. "You have to make a hole about this size," she explained, demonstrating with her hands. "Not too deep, not too shallow. The plant needs to feel secure, but also needs room to grow." Richard tried to imitate her movements, but his hands, accustomed only to signing contracts and pressing buttons on phones, were clumsy with the soil. Emily laughed softly at his first attempts. "It's not about strength," she said, placing her hand on his to guide the movement. "It's about sensitivity." Her touch sent a wave of warmth through Richard's arm. It was a completely innocent, professional touch, but he felt as if an electric current had traveled through his body. He realized that he couldn't remember the last time someone had touched him without ulterior motives, without seeking something in return. They worked side by side for almost an hour, and Richard discovered that there was something deeply satisfying about working with his hands in creating something that would grow and flourish. Emily was a patient teacher, correcting his mistakes without judgment and celebrating his small successes. When they finished, Richard looked at his dirt-covered hands with a strange satisfaction. He felt more relaxed than he had felt in months, perhaps years. "Thank you for the lesson," he said genuinely. "Thank you for the help," Emily replied. "The lavenders will look beautiful here." Richard realized that she had said, "will look," projecting a future where he would still be there to see the plants grow. The idea pleased him more than it should have. The next morning brought an unexpected transformation in Richard's behavior. He woke up even before dawn, seized by an anxiety he couldn't explain. His first concern was to know if Emily was already working in the gardens. He dressed quickly and went down to check. Not finding her in the usual spot, he felt a disproportionate pang of disappointment. He walked through all the gardens, looking for her with an urgency that made him uncomfortable with himself. When he finally found her in the greenhouse, organizing seeds for the afternoon planting, he experienced a relief that surprised him. "Good morning," he said, trying to sound casual, but realizing that his voice carried an obvious anxiety. Emily looked up from the seeds and greeted him with her usual politeness, but Richard noticed that she seemed slightly surprised to see him so early and in a location where he had never appeared before. "Do you need something, sir?" she asked, pausing her work. "No, just was walking," Richard lied, realizing how weak the excuse sounded. The truth was that he had gone out specifically to find her, but he couldn't admit that even to himself. During breakfast, Richard found himself watching the greenhouse through the veranda window. When Emily went out to work in the external beds, he followed her with his eyes, memorizing every movement. Mrs. Wilson noticed his growing distraction. "Are you satisfied with Emily's work?" asked the housekeeper, following his gaze. The question caught Richard off guard. "Why do you ask?" "I've noticed that you've been observing the garden work a lot lately," Mrs. Wilson replied diplomatically. "If there's any problem with the quality of service—" "No," Richard interrupted more abruptly than he intended. "Her work is excellent, very professional." Mrs. Wilson nodded, but Richard noticed a thoughtful look in her eyes. He understood that his excessive attention to Emily wasn't going unnoticed by other employees. This perception should have alerted him to moderate his behavior, but instead, it seemed to intensify his need to be close to Emily. Over the following days, Richard found increasingly elaborate excuses to appear in the gardens. He began to make regular inspections of the facilities, always timing them to coincide with Emily's working hours. He invented sudden interests in gardening, asking for detailed explanations about cultivation techniques. He went to the point of requesting written reports on the progress of the plants, something completely unnecessary, but that gave him an official reason to interact with her. Emily initially responded to his requests with professionalism, but Richard began to notice subtle signs of discomfort. She avoided prolonged eye contact, kept conversations strictly focused on work, and began to use alternative paths around the property when she wasn't working. The first clear manifestation of jealousy happened when Richard saw Emily chatting animatedly with Thomas, the head gardener who had been working at the retreat for 5 years. They were discussing the pruning of rose bushes, but the naturalness of the conversation and Emily's smiles awakened an inexplicable fury in Richard. He approached the group with exaggerated authority, interrupting the conversation to give unnecessary instructions about the work schedule. Thomas, accustomed to the temperament of rich bosses, accepted the intrusion without questioning, but Richard saw a flash of confusion in Emily's eyes. After Thomas walked away, Emily turned to Richard with an expression that he couldn't completely decipher. "Was there a problem with the conversation we were having?" she asked directly. Richard felt exposed, as if she could see through his motivations. "I just wanted to ensure that deadlines are met," he responded, but even he realized how false the answer sounded. Emily studied him for a moment before nodding and returning to work, but Richard realized that something had changed in the way she looked at him. There was a new caution in her eyes, a protection that hadn't existed before. This change, instead of making him back off, only intensified his obsession. Richard began to interpret every interaction Emily had with other employees as a personal threat. When she helped one of the caretakers with a heavy task, he saw flirting. When she shared fruits from the garden in the kitchen, he saw attempts to draw attention. His need to control Emily's interactions manifested in seemingly logical business decisions. He reorganized work schedules to minimize the time she spent with other male employees. He created new rules about operational efficiency that in practice limited casual conversations among employees. Emily, observing these changes, began to understand that they were specifically directed at her. The perception brought a growing discomfort that she tried to manage by focusing exclusively on her professional tasks. Richard, in turn, interpreted Emily's intensified dedication to work as a positive response to his administrative improvements. He convinced himself that he was creating an environment where she could thrive without unnecessary distractions. The situation reached a critical point when Richard hired a new employee for general maintenance of the property. Ryan was a young man, close to Emily's age, and his arrival aroused in Richard an anxiety that he couldn't disguise. During Ryan's first week at the retreat, Richard observed him obsessively, looking for signs of inappropriate interest in Emily. When he saw them talking briefly about the location of gardening tools, Richard immediately intervened with an urgent task that separated the two. Emily noticed this intervention and many others that followed. She began to perceive a pattern in Richard's behavior that left her deeply uncomfortable. He wasn't just supervising the work, he was controlling her social interactions. Confirmation of her suspicions came when Richard appeared in the gardens. During her lunch break, a time she habitually spent alone, reading a book under the shade of a tree, he had brought a sandwich and suggested they have an informal work meeting about landscaping plans. Emily realized it wasn't a coincidence. Richard had discovered her moments of solitude and was systematically invading them. The realization brought an uncomfortable clarity about the nature of his attention. "Mr. Richard," she said, closing the book and facing him directly, "may I ask you a question?" "Of course," he replied, pleased by the direct attention she was giving him. "Why do you have so much interest in my work specifically?" asked Emily. "There are other employees here who have been here much longer than me, but you've never shown the same level of supervision." The question caught Richard completely off guard. He had convinced himself that his attention was professional, motivated by quality standards. Confronted with Emily's perception, he couldn't formulate a response that sounded convincing. "I just want to ensure that you feel valued," he stammered, immediately realizing how the answer revealed more than he intended. Emily nodded slowly, but Richard saw in her eyes that she had understood exactly what was happening. It wasn't professional appreciation. It was something much more personal and concerning. "I appreciate the consideration," she said carefully, "but I can assure you that I feel perfectly comfortable with my work and don't need special attention." The subtle but clear rejection of Richard's intentions awakened in him a mixture of frustration and despair. For the first time in his life, someone was establishing boundaries that he couldn't simply buy or circumvent with his power. That night, Richard spent hours on the veranda, looking at the gardens where Emily worked during the day. He felt divided between the desire to respect the boundaries she had established and a growing compulsion to be close to her, to be part of her life in some way. The internal struggle consumed him, and for the first time in decades, Richard Morgan faced a situation where his will couldn't simply be imposed through resources or authority. Emily had become uncharted territory in his life experience, and he didn't know how to navigate this new terrain without his usual instruments of control. The tension at the retreat had become palpable. Richard could no longer hide his growing agitation, and Emily felt constantly observed, as if every movement were monitored and analyzed. The situation reached its limit when Richard made a mistake that would reveal the true extent of his obsession. It was a Tuesday morning when Emily received a call on her cell phone. Richard, who was casually walking near the gardens, heard the conversation only partially, but caught enough to understand that it was a man. The voice on the other end of the line sounded affectionate, and Emily laughed spontaneously, a naturalness that Richard rarely witnessed. When Emily ended the call, Richard approached with poorly disguised tension. "Everything okay?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but his eyes betrayed the anxious curiosity. "Yes, thank you," Emily replied, returning to work without elaborating. The lack of details left Richard consumed by curiosity. For the rest of the day, he invented excuses to appear in the gardens, hoping that Emily would mention the call or give some clue about who had called. But she kept her personal life completely private, treating him with the same professional cordiality as always. That night, Richard could barely sleep. His mind created increasingly elaborate scenarios about who might have called Emily. A boyfriend? An ex-husband? The possibility that she had intimate relationships with other people aroused in him an anguish that he couldn't control. The next morning, Richard made a decision that would reveal how far his obsession had progressed. Using his resources and connections, he managed to discover personal information about Emily through a private investigation. He discovered that the call had been from her younger brother, who lived in another city and faced financial difficulties. Armed with this information, Richard elaborated a plan. He would convince Emily that he knew about her family difficulties and would offer financial help, thus creating a personal connection that she couldn't ignore. He found Emily late in the afternoon when she was watering the plants in the greenhouse. The golden light of the evening filtered through the glass walls, creating an almost magical atmosphere that Richard interpreted as an auspicious sign. "Emily," he said, approaching with an expression that tried to convey understanding and generosity, "I'd like to talk to you about something important." Emily paused what she was doing, and Richard noticed an immediate tension in her posture. She had learned to recognize when his conversations were about to cross professional boundaries. "If it's about work..." "Of course," she replied cautiously. "Actually, it's about your family," said Richard, carefully observing her reaction. "I know your brother is facing some difficulties, and I'd like to offer help." The color disappeared from Emily's face. She stared at him with a mixture of shock, fear, and anger that Richard hadn't anticipated. "How do you know about my brother?" she asked, her voice trembling. Slightly. Richard realized too late that he had made a serious mistake. Emily's reaction wasn't gratitude, but a sense of privacy violation. "I just overheard your phone conversation yesterday," he lied, trying to minimize the invasion. "And I thought I could help." "You spied on me?" Emily's voice rose in tone laden with indignation. "Investigated my personal life?" Richard found himself cornered by his own impulsiveness. He tried to explain his intentions, talk about his genuine desire to help, but Emily interrupted him with a firmness he had never seen in her. "Stop," she said, raising her hand. "Just stop." Emily walked to the greenhouse counter and leaned on it, as if she needed physical support. Richard could see that she was trembling, not from fear but from contained anger. "Since I arrived here," she said, turning to face him again, "I noticed strange changes. The modified work schedules, the new rules, the constant supervision. I thought it was coincidence, that perhaps you were just very meticulous with employees." Richard tried to interrupt, but she continued with a determination he couldn't break. "But it wasn't professionalism, it was possessiveness. You're not interested in my work, you're interested in controlling me." The word controlling hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. That was exactly what he was doing, but hearing the truth expressed so clearly was devastating. "Emily, you don't understand," he tried. "I care about you. I've never felt this for anyone before." "Care?" repeated Emily, her voice laden with disbelief. "Invading someone's privacy, manipulating their work environment, spying on their conversations. That's not caring, Mr. Richard. That's obsession." Richard felt as if the ground was disappearing beneath his feet. For weeks he had convinced himself that his feelings were pure, that he was developing a genuine relationship with Emily. Confronted with the reality of his actions, he realized how distorted his perception had become. "I thought that," he began, but Emily interrupted him again. "You thought you could buy me, control me, transform me into another one of your possessions." Her voice was calm now, but laden with a deep sadness. "I'm not an object to be acquired, Mr. Richard. I'm a person with my own life, my own family, and my own choices." Richard realized that Emily was crying, silent tears that ran down her face while she maintained her dignity intact. The sight of those tears, knowing that he was responsible for them, broke something fundamental inside him. "Emily, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "You're right. I lost control, lost the notion of what I was doing." "You never lost control," corrected Emily. "You tried to exercise control over me the same way you control everything else in your life. The difference is that I'm not for sale." Richard fell heavily into a greenhouse chair, finally understanding the magnitude of his mistakes. His entire life had been built on the premise that money and power could solve any problem, achieve any goal. Emily had been the first person to show him that some things, the most important ones, couldn't be bought or controlled. "What are you going to do?" he asked, fearing the answer. Emily observed him for a long moment, as if making a final decision. "I'll finish my work until the end of the week," she said. "Then I'll leave. I can't continue working in a place where I don't feel safe." "Please," begged Richard, "let me fix this. Let me learn to be different." Emily sadly shook her head. "Mr. Richard, you need to learn to be different for yourself, not for me. As long as you see people as things to be conquered, you'll continue to be alone no matter how much money you have." In the following days, Richard observed Emily finish her last jobs in the garden. She kept her word, completing all pending tasks with the same professionalism as always, but avoiding any unnecessary interaction with him. During these days, Richard had time to reflect on Emily's words. He realized that his entire life had been built on transactional relationships, employees who obeyed for money, business partners motivated by profit, even romantic relationships based on status and convenience. Emily had been the first person to treat him simply as a human being, without exaggerated reverence or interest in his fortune. And he had destroyed that precious connection by trying to transform it into yet another relationship he could control. On Emily's last day at the retreat, Richard found her doing a final check in the greenhouse. She was verifying that all plants were properly cared for whoever would replace her. "Emily," he said softly, maintaining a respectful distance. "Thank you." She looked at him with surprise. "For what?" "For showing me who I've really become," Richard replied. "And for giving me the chance to be better." Emily nodded, and for the first time since the confrontation, her eyes showed something beyond caution, perhaps a glimpse of hope that he could actually learn from what had happened. When Emily left, Richard was alone at the retreat, for the first time since he had arrived. The gardens remained beautiful, but seemed empty without her presence. He understood that he missed not only Emily, but the person he had begun to become when he was near her, more human, more connected, more real. Richard spent the following months rethinking not just his relationship with Emily, but his entire approach to life. He began therapy, something he had always considered unnecessary. He implemented changes in his companies, focusing on fairer relationships with employees. He learned gardening alone, as a way to honor the lessons Emily had tried to teach him about patience and natural growth. A year later, Richard received a letter. It was from Emily, thanking him for respecting her decision to leave and informing him that she had opened her own landscaping business in her hometown. She didn't mention the possibility of meeting again, but wished him well on his journey of personal growth. Richard smiled as he read the letter, carefully storing it away. He had learned that truly loving someone sometimes meant letting them go. Emily had given him the most valuable gift of his life, the opportunity to discover who he could be when he stopped trying to control the world around him. In the garden of the retreat, the lavenders they had planted together bloomed magnificently, filling the air with their soft fragrance. Richard watered them every morning, remembering Emily's words about giving things time to grow naturally. He too was growing, slowly but steadily, learning that true wealth wasn't in what one could possess, but in what one could become. The end, dear. Listeners, we hope the story of Richard and Emily has touched you deeply. This journey about discovering the difference between controlling and truly loving is just one of the many emotional narratives we've prepared for you. To continue this emotional journey, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like on the video. We have a special playlist with equally moving stories waiting for you, stories that explore the mysteries of the human heart and the challenges of finding authentic connections in a complex world. Don't miss our upcoming content, as each story is an opportunity to reflect on our own journeys. Share your reflections in the comments. We love to know how these stories